Hey YouTube, Baubles on a lot here. Back with the second half of my reading of a long article in New Scientist magazine concerning the origins of white nationalism, commencing page 34, New Scientist, 9 June 2018. Part 1 we covered page 34 and 35, most of 36 and most of 37, together with this inclusion from page 39, with these three quotes. So we might as well set the stage with three more quotes. It shows that the embrace of those really terrible ideas could be a consequence of an immersion in the culture rather than the cause of an attraction to the culture. Simi's analysis teases out the possible driving factors. About 80% of his interviewees have experienced childhood traumas, violence, sexual abuse, and broken homes. See What Makes a Racist, left. Peter Simi's research among former white supremacists has shown that many experienced childhood emotional trauma and are predisposed to crime. Of the 103 people he studied, half report witnessing serious acts of violence growing up. Half report experiencing physical abuse during childhood. 1/4 report being sexually abused during childhood. Half report being expelled or dropping out of school. 3/4 report a history of physical aggression before they got involved in far-right politics. Half report exposure to parental racism. More than 3/4 report parental divorce. Half ran away from home during childhood or adolescence. Half were shoplifters or petty criminals. Slightly less than half report a family history of mental health problems. 2/3 report substance abuse issues. 2/3 report attempting suicide. What makes a racist? Many had horrible, shame-filled childhoods that morphed into lonely, self-hating adulthoods. White power groups can provide angry loners with a sense of pride in community and conveniently dehumanise targets to blame. White supremacist propaganda is filled with references to collective shame related to feelings of cultural, racial, and economic dispossession, from the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War to the election of Barack Obama as the first non-white US president. The behavioural problems represent lives spinning out of control, says Simi. Resorting to violent extremism can be a coping mechanism for these people. They are drawn towards violent extremist groups for non-ideological reasons. For shelter, protection, a sense of family. As happened with Chuck. His parents, he says, were pot-smoking hippies who failed to recognise that the male babysitter was sexually molesting him on a regular basis. I just kind of buried that, and it turned into shame and then anger and then self-hatred. That got projected onto the world. The sun sets and he rides away on his motorcycle. Most of these guys are not crazed lunatics, says Simi, but neither are they socially or psychologically healthy. They carry invisible scars. Sociological research on extremists is difficult to design. Researchers cannot advertise for Nazis or violent white supremacists to join a scientific study. Simi developed his volunteer cohorts of active and former extremists by gaining the trust of his often paranoid subjects, one interview at a time. Interviewees then suggested others for him to contact in a method called snowballing. This is not a randomised process. It is subject to ethical review by institutional boards, and Simi's studies are required not to cause harm to his subjects. His studies of individual life histories differ in method and level of detail from his previous real-time ethnographic observations of active white supremacists. Starting in the mid-1990s, Simi was a guest in the noose-draped homes of white supremacists for days and sometimes weeks. He attended white power music festivals in the wilds of Idaho and birthday parties in honour of Adolf Hitler. Encounters detailed in a 2010 book, American Swastika, co-authored with sociologist Robert Futrell. Simi's entry ticket was an easygoing demeanour, an ability to drink lots of beer, and the colour of his skin. White power families can seem like any other from the outside. They live in suburban homes, mow the lawn, do run-of-the-mill jobs, but the Christmas tree is often topped with a SWAT sticker, not a star. They give their kids racist colouring books. They rally around burning crosses, an ancient Scottish war signal. Armed with automatic weapons, they train to exterminate non-white people. Some of Simi's field subjects had been convicted of attempted lynchings, aggravated assaults and murder. They would happily have stomped him if they had smelled a rat, he recalls. He made a point of identifying himself up front as a scientist studying their culture, appealing to vanity perhaps. Not everyone was thrilled by his presence. He did not pretend to agree with racist politics, but he didn't argue with his hosts either, or ask the wrong kinds of questions about weapons or criminal acts. He kept the conversations tracked on cultural and ideological issues, while observing the interplay of relationships in the environment. In the late 1990s, Simi spent time with an itinerant Hammerskin musician named Wade Michael Page. He had been recruited into organised racism while in the US Army after the First Persian Gulf War. Years later, in 2012, Page gunned 6 Sikhs to death at a temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, before being killed by police. Simi didn't see it coming specifically, he says, but he was not shocked. The bass guitarist had many risk factors for violent behaviour, including chronic depression, alcoholism, and suicidal ideation. Adding in white supremacy proved to be a recipe for terrorism. But not every white supremacist with these risk factors opens fire on a minority church congregation or points their car at an anti-fascist protester and accelerates. The idea of predicting something as complicated and as rare as terrorism is just not realistic, says Simi. Terrorism is primed when an emotionally damaged person meets the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Zal did jail time for his violent deeds, and now he regularly tells the story of how he de-radicalised at the Los Angeles Museum of Tolerance. But the Charlottesville March triggered something deep inside him. The chant, "Jews will not replace us," horrified most people. For a moment, Zal thrilled at the prospect that the revolution might finally be on. Such momentary relapses are not uncommon, says Simi. In 2017, Simi and Blee, together with colleagues Matthew D. Michel and Stephen Windisch, presented a study of 89 former white supremacists in American Sociological Review. They wrote that, quote, the habitual and unwanted thoughts, feelings, physiological responses and behaviour that can follow exit, unquote, from active status mirrors the effects of withdrawing from opiate addiction. It may be no coincidence that, as Simi's earlier study showed, many white supremacists are also substance abusers. The reward of hate may be dopamine too. In an unpublished pilot for a future study, Simi and collaborators at the University of Nebraska and the National Institutes of Health have taken functional magnetic resonance imaging and electroencephalograph scans of the brains of 5 repentant white supremacists and a control group of 5 mixed martial arts fighters whose brains were likely to show similar signs of trauma. The volunteers were shown symbols and images designed to be neutral or to activate the former white supremacist's previous identity and ideological orientation. The experiment found significant activation in the emotion processing regions of the brains of the former white supremacists in response to racially charged images, such as of an interracial couple. No regions were activated for the control group. The researchers conclude that the inherent racial bias in former white supremacists happens before more active cognitive processing. In her 2002 book, Inside Organised Racism, Blee observes that the mainstay of any substantial racist movement is not the pathological individual, but rather a pathological vein of racism, intolerance, and bigotry in the larger population that the movement successfully mines, unquote. Unconscious bias towards protecting our in-groups is a natural, evolutionarily adaptive feature of the human psyche and the wellspring of racism. Shortly after the violence in Charlottesville, an ABC News Washington Post poll reported that 9% of adults in the US surveyed, equivalent to about 22 million people, said it is acceptable to hold the neo-Nazi or white supremacist views. 22 million neo-Nazis in America. 9% of them say it's okay. In a roundabout way, that answers the question of why only very few people with horrible childhoods and other risk factors for violence end up kicking people with razor blade tipped boots. They are the extreme values in a bell curve that covers all forms of social racism. That provides at least some handle on how to counter the problem, both through tackling childhood trauma and rooting out racism in society as a whole. For Zal, the path out of his addiction to hatred opened up unexpectedly after he became a parent. I was with my 3-year-old son at a grocery store, and he says, "Look, Daddy, there's a big..." and he dropped the N-bomb in the store. The black guy just walks away, shaking his head. But all of these little white ladies are screaming and hollering at me. I mean, old ladies. "Oh, how dare you? How dare you teach your child these things?" And my son looks up at me and says, "Aren't you going to beat them up, Daddy?" That was my moment of clarity. Little kid in the shop says, "Look, Daddy, there's a big nigger." And the black fella, he just walked out shaking his head. And the little old white ladies took the neo-Nazi to task and explained to him what a low-grade scumbag, dickhead he had been as a parent. I trust that illuminated some of what's going on, because to me it all sort of had the ring of truth. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.